Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. What's the stupidest mistake that professional assassins could make? Find out on Murder Mile. Today, I'm standing outside of the Marriott Hotel at 134 George Street in Marble Arch, W1. A few doors down from the senseless killing of the artist Harry Michelson, 2 streets north of the failed assassination of the ex-Iraqi Prime Minister Abd al-Razak Saeed al-Naif, 2 streets south of the Blackout Ripper's first official killing, and a short walk from the green-fingered maniac. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Situated on the corner of George Street and Fawcett Street, a discreet side street at the back of Edgware Road, the Marriott is a 4-star, 13-floored hotel, as used by businessmen, tourists, and a wealth of utter numpties who are only in town to blow their dole money at the casinos. All dressed in shiny gold suits, courtesy of Primark. They toss their £5 chips into the table like it's a cool £1 million. Evil eye their pie-eyed opponent, a bin man called Clive, like he's an evil agent of Spectre, and hug 2 octogenarian honeys called Enid and Nora, like they're Bond girls. Obviously, not the most beautiful Bond girl.
I'm the money.
Every penny of it.
So it makes no sense that the victim, an inveterate gambler who lived and died here, booked himself into this venue, being one of several large hotels in the area which didn't have a casino. But he did. This was a cruel murder which initially baffled the police. It had all the hallmarks of a professional hit by experienced assassins who were hired to whack out a rival for the sake of money, revenge, and respect. Yet it ended with a cataclysmic cock-up, which showed these hitmen to be truly incompetent. My name is Michael. I'm your tour guide. This is Murder Mile. Episode 342. The Hitmen. The day was Sunday. The date was the 28th of March 2004, and the time was 8:20 p.m. The newspapers were slim, as the main stories were Hurricane Katrina hitting Brazil and resulting in no casualties, the Hamas leader declaring war on the USA, again, and the death of actor Peter Ustinov, aged 81. Having been contacted by their colleagues at Kent Police, a patrol had arrived at the Marriott to do a welfare check on one of their guests. Staff had knocked on his door, but they got no reply. The room's phone was rang, but again, nothing. And to preserve any forensics should a crime have been committed, the door to either room 701 or 703, depending on which source reported this story, was only opened by the manager with a passkey in the presence of the police. There were no signs of a break-in, and the hotel's keycard system confirmed he had entered his room earlier that morning at 9:54 a.m. And that was the last time the keycard was used, and he was seen alive. Inside, the room was a standard double, spacious and comfortable. The light and the television had been left on. The red and yellow sheets on the king-size bed were crumpled as if someone had recently slept in them. But the duvet was empty, and the suitcase was open and partially unpacked. The room was messy, which could have implied there'd been a struggle, or as most hoteliers know, some guests are real pigs. Across the pillow were patches of blood, as if the occupant had had a severe nosebleed, and struggling to stem the flow, he had stumbled to the bathroom, stepping on his own spilled fluids, and that was where he was found. Naked, in the bath, up to his neck in a slightly pinkish water, stone cold, and decidedly dead. Roughly 98,000 people die every year in hotel rooms across the world, with many 200-roomed hotels experiencing roughly 1 or 2 deaths annually, whether by sickness, accident, suicide, poisoning, or very occasionally a murder. And although drowning due to an embolism was mooted, with this deemed suspicious as his cause of death was uncertain, the room was forensically examined and an autopsy was ordered. The unidentified victim, a male in his mid-40s, of Eastern European or Middle Eastern origin, balding with short greying hair, had been dead at the time his body was found for just over 12 hours. With blood and bath water in his airway, it was obvious he was alive when he bled, but close to dying by the time he got into the bath, which made no sense at all, as how did he get there and how did he undress? The hot water of the bath had caused his skin to swell and to redden, which had masked a series of faint bruises. Some looked as if he'd been grabbed, dragged, and others like he'd been beaten with fists. With his blood and saliva found on the pillow's underside, it was clear that he'd been smothered and manually strangled, possibly by 1 or 2 people. And although by putting him in a hot bath, that had eradicated many of the forensic clues, 4 partial lines of ripped out hairs at the wrists and ankles and faint traces of adhesive suggested he'd been bound with duct tape, later removed after his death. The pathologist concluded
he had not died by natural causes.
With no witnesses to the killing or clues to his killers, police determined this was a professional hit, most likely a mafia or gangland killing. But what baffled them further was the victim's identity, as he checked in using a Greek passport. He had an Israeli passport under the name of Yermia Yunataev, and a Russian one under the name of Simion Turkov. His identity was so confusing, his death was registered by the Westminster coroner twice under both names. But with his blood matching a profile on the DNA database, his true ID was later confirmed. This was Simion Turkov. Born on the 17th of March 1958 in Russia, Simion Turkov, also known as Simon, was raised in Cold War-era Moscow, right through to the beginning of the collapse of communism in the late 1980s and the slow dissolving of the Soviet state in 1991, when democracy mistakenly seemed to have changed Russia for good. Little is known about his early life, being raised by his father Ram and his mother Zenaida. We know he was university educated and had a smart business brain. But as one of 750,000 Russian Jews who fled the USSR as it began to collapse, in 1989 he emigrated to Tel Aviv in Israel, set his parents up in a well-appointed flat in an industrial city 8 miles northeast of Tel Aviv, and descended back into criminality. On the surface, Turkov came across as charming, sociable, quick-witted and flashy, a businessman who loved to gamble. But underneath, he was a prominent member of the émigré Russian Mafia in Israel, who an intelligence source stated
was very much a big player.
And he also lived a double life. Prior to fleeing Russia, in the mid to late 1980s,
Turkov had ambitions to break into London through his mafia contacts.
And keen to keep himself low profile, he adopted the unassuming identity of a hard-working man. In the mid-1980s, he married Maureen McShane. In June 1987, they had a daughter called Danielle. In April 1989, they married. And in February 1991, a second daughter called Mishka was born. With 2 loving children, a softly spoken wife, a 3-bedroom semi-detached stone-clad house at 15 Palmerston Road, a quiet residential street in Upton, and driving an unremarkable Vauxhall Cavalier and earning a living as a doorman at the Victoria Sporting Club Casino in Bournemouth, he seemed like any other émigré who'd come to England to to make a better life for himself, living legally and honestly. Turkov was a man with big plans who lived beyond his means. And having lost his job as a doorman at the casino, in 1991 at Bournemouth Crown Court, he was given a 12-month suspended sentence for 2 years for falsely obtaining £18,000 worth of credit from Barclays, Club 24 and the Allied Trust. Some he spent on a BMW, a TV and jewellery, but most was to pay off his ever-escalating gambling debts. The judge Jeremy Gibbons said,
Gambling was his Achilles heel.
but so was money and crime. But although Poole, a pleasant coastal town in Dorset, is famous for its stunning scenery across the English Channel, it's also a port town as equally famous for its long history of piracy and smuggling. On the 14th of May 1996, having boarded the ferry at Cherbourg, Turkov and his friend Brian Lawrence, a market trader from Cosham, arrived at Poole Ferry Terminal, having smuggled in the petrol tank of a Luxembourg-registered Ford Scorpio 26 kilos of cannabis resin, worth £75,000 or £154,000 today. At the same time, his friend Alan Mosen and a French colleague were driving a similar saloon and were stopped at the French-Spanish border with 31.5 kilos of resin, totalling £200,000 or £410,000 today. They were caught as a spot check by a keen-eyed customs official who said,
2 men in a large saloon is very suspicious, and saloon petrol tanks are popular with smugglers.
All 4 men were arrested and tried at Bournemouth Crown Court. But as would become his habit, on the 19th of February 1997, the very last day of his trial, when his co-smugglers were sentenced to 6 years in prison, Turkov led the court and phoned his solicitor to say,
I'm abroad. I'm not coming back. I can't face a prison sentence.
Convicted in absentia, he fled to Tel Aviv using a fake Israeli passport and abandoned his wife and children. But as a selfish, greedy thief, Israel was where the money was. In the years leading up to the Second Intifada, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict beginning in September 2000, Israel had become a hotspot for organised crime, as with the country ripped apart by car bombs, civil unrest and war.
The Israeli police had lost control of the country's organised criminals, who were making millions from gambling, prostitution and drugs.
Ex-Israeli police chief Asaf Haaretz claimed that $2.5 billion in dirty money had flooded into Israel, as where there's war, there's profit to be made. Turkov set up a fake Israeli company called BMD Limited, which vaguely claimed to
import and export products and merchandise.
Which wasn't a lie, just as it wasn't strictly the truth, as according to the Evening Standard,
he exported cocaine and heroin to Europe and Britain,
as well as young women for sex. According to an informer,
Turkov brought prostitutes from all over the world,
mostly from Eastern Europe and the Ukraine. He smuggled them in. He gave them fake papers to prove their Jewish ancestry. He paid his suppliers £35,000 for each girl, and he controlled 4 brothels with around 40 sex workers. Turkov was a greedy thief who only cared about himself. And although he was already married with 2 children, he bigamously married Denise McDonough, set her up in the flat he had arranged for his parents through his ill-gotten gains of drugs and sexual slavery, and made her the other, Mrs. Turkov. In 2001, as if he hadn't brought enough misery and pain to the world, Turkov tried smuggling 100,000 ecstasy tablets into Israel from Egypt. The cargo was seized. Turkov was sentenced to 8 years at Salman, the largest prison in Israel. And with the shipment owned by the Russian Mafia having been destroyed, Turkov would be in debt with them until it was paid back, with either his money or his blood. He would be dead if he returned back to Russia, tortured if he returned to Israel, and although a wanted man in Britain for drug smuggling, in 2003, 2 years into his sentence, being allowed a home visit. This time, he abandoned his second wife Denise, using his fake Greek passport and fleeing back to England. According to an unnamed Israeli intelligence source,
London is seen as being safe for criminals. It's one of the organised crime centres of the world. Russian Mafia, Albanian, Greek Cypriot, Colombian and Israeli, who with the Russians are among the nastiest of the lot. In my view, Turkov hoped to base himself in London and to restart his criminal career, well away from his old cronies in Tel Aviv.
1 week after his birthday, on the St. Patrick's Day of 2004, using his fake Greek passport, Simion Turkov booked into the Marriott at 134 George Street in Marylebone, W1. He was meant to be keeping a low profile, but as a big player on the London casino scene, his face was very well known. And again, as a selfish, greedy pariah and a blood-sucking leech who sucked all of the goodness and joy out of life's heart. Having abandoned his wife, his children, his parents, and his bigamous wife. Like a cartoon gangster, he lived with his Russian mistress in the hotels of Belgravia. He planned to bring his vile brothels to London, and he laid as low as he could as the Russian Mafia wanted his head. Every day he looked over his shoulder, expecting but never knowing if someone had been sent to kill him. But oddly, it wasn't the gangsters, the pimps or the drug dealers who ordered his death, but a rival gambler from Belgium called Misha, who he owed £200,000. As with all professional hitmen, almost nothing is known about them, as unlike Turkov, the attention-seeking, champagne-swilling playboy gambler, their job was to stay off the radar and remain anonymous. The first was Andrei Melnikov, who looked more like a surfer than an assassin, and had only appeared in the newspapers twice in his early years. In 1993, when, as an English teacher, he chaperoned a group of Russian school children on a 40-day placement in New Jersey. And in 1995, when, as a hot dog vendor in Moscow, he spoke to the press about his disinterest in voting in the upcoming free election. As for the second, 53-year-old Michael Antoneli, a businessman from Antwerp in Belgium, nothing is known about his life or his crimes, but both men were suspected of being Russian Mafia. On Saturday the 27th of March 2004, just a few hours before the killing, using fake but perfect passports, the hired assassins, Melnikov and Antoneli, entered Britain via the ferry port at Dover, just before midnight. Their entry would go unnoticed by customs. They would deliberately break no laws such as speeding, so as not to rouse any suspicion. And having murdered Turkov as agreed, they would head back to Calais in less than 24 hours, and using a nondescript day return ticket, they would vanish into Europe. They would be fast, efficient, and low-key. In a phone box outside the Marriott Hotel, Melnikov called Turkov's mobile. Moments later, Turkov arrived in a taxi, and according to the driver,
he looked anxious and agitated.
The CCTV captured all three men meeting, and to make it feel comfortable, but also maybe for the cameras, they embraced him warmly as a friend, and all three of them went into the Pickled Hen, the hotel's bar, where they sat drinking coffee and whiskey, reminiscing about old times, and generally having a pleasant chat. As the night headed into the wee small hours of Sunday the 28th of March 2004, the three men headed to the Gloucester, a Grosvenor casino inside of the Millennium Hotel on Harrington Gardens in South Kensington. And being seen on CCTV walking together along Gloucester Road at 3:45 a.m, this aroused no suspicion, as London can be a 24-hour city if you know where to look, and for many tourists, they do. Melnikov and Antoneli made Turkov feel comfortable. They got him drunk, and they made sure he had a good night as a false sense of security, as if a hit hadn't been placed on his head. They drank, but never to excess. They chatted, but were never loud. They dressed down and were never flashy. And only placing small bets, they were polite but forgettable to the casino staff, having blended into the crowd. At 9:05 a.m, Turkov travelled back to the Marriott alone. The black com cab arrived at 9:05 a.m, and as he sat alone in the hotel lobby drinking coffee, at 9:50 a.m, he took the lift up to his room on the 7th floor. Moments later, with no witnesses hearing a single sound, Simion Turkov was murdered. With no damage to the door, and with so many guests checking out at around that hour, no one saw his assassins enter his room, so either they'd knocked and been invited in, or they'd acquired a spare key. Detective Chief Inspector Julian Worker, who headed up the investigation, initially said,
"This was a very professional job and will be very difficult to solve."
In a public appeal, he continued,
"We're trying to piece together his last movements and to trace the man he was seen walking along Gloucester Road with in the early hours of the Sunday morning. I'm seeking a black com cab who dropped Mr. Turkov at the hotel at 9:05 a.m. If you're a cab driver and were working in the area, do you recognise the two men? Did you pick them up? Even in the early hours of Sunday, this is a busy part of London, and I'm confident that there are people who can help."
As so far, the assassins had done everything to remain anonymous.
But with an overall majority of only 3.
Inside of the room, Turkov was gagged, so nobody could hear him scream. Having pinned him to the bed with his ankles and wrists bound with duct tape, he couldn't fight back, flee, or knock anything over to alert the neighbours. And with the TV turned up to a moderate level, nothing suspicious was heard. As punishment for reneging on the £200,000 debt he owed to Misha in Belgium, he was beaten about the body in parts where the bruises wouldn't be so obvious, and possibly tortured to give up the sight of his money, but whether he did or whether he had any left is unknown, and for that he was killed. One of his assassins held his pillow over his face so he couldn't breathe. To ensure he would die, the other strangled him with his hand, pressing their thumb into his windpipe so as not to leave an obvious bruise of 4 fingers and a thumb. And with him bleeding and barely breathing, they stripped him of his bloodstained jeans, Versace belt and jacket, dragged his limp and lifeless body to the bath as he bled, and barely being conscious and unable to hold his head up straight, in the hot water, he sunk. Anyone who would have found him, lying there, maybe with a glass of whiskey, cocaine in his night bag, bleeding from his nose, and with no clear bruises, would assume that he'd overdosed and died. It was a textbook hit, which gave the assassins enough time to flee, and with it initially seen as suspicious but likely a suicide or an accident, the police wouldn't be looking for a killer. But several questions were left unanswered by the crime scene. If he was unconscious, how did he get from the bed to the bath? Why was his blood and saliva on the underside of the pillow? Why did he have adhesive tape glue on his wrists and ankles? And most baffling of all, given the fact that he looked as if he'd had a nosebleed and had drowned in the bath. Why did he remove the hotel stationery from the room? How did he get in using the room key, and where was it now? And how did he undress before entering the bath? And where were his clothes? Dead men don't go to laundrettes, and they certainly don't dispose of their own rubbish. But these were small mistakes, innocent little slip-ups, which no one would notice for hours, by which time, with the unseen anonymous assassins already heading back to the Dover ferry port to catch their pre-arranged return trip back to Calais, into Europe, they would then vanish. Their escape was perfect. They left the Marriott at different times via separate exits, no later than an hour after the murder. Meeting at a predetermined spot, far from any cameras, they drove away in a Mercedes they'd rented for the day, and at a legal speed, they drove towards the ferry terminus. It was precision personified. And then they made a massive cock-up. At the tollgate service station near Gillingham in Kent, a small but serviceable petrol station on the A2 at the Gravesend Road, Michael Runter was busy washing his car when a Mercedes pulled up beside him, and in broad daylight, two men talking in Russian, which for many is odd enough, opened their car boot, and with one of them wearing bright yellow marigold gloves on his hands, as if he'd just been washing his dishes, he pulled out a yellow carrier bag, dumped it into a wheelie bin, and drove away. Either he was a germaphobe with some rubbish to dispose of, or this was something sinister. Uncertain of which, Michael peeped inside the bin, and spotting some blood-stained towels, he called the police. Underneath the towels used to clean up the crime scene, forensics found a real treasure trove of evidence, such as Simion Turkov's bloody clothes, a receipt for the hotel bar where they'd shared a drink together, a set of complimentary hotel stationery, and most bafflingly of all, the key card to the murder scene. As planned, the hitmen drove to Dover, hopped the ferry to Calais, and again going their separate ways, with Antoneli heading to Antwerp and Melnikov to Tel Aviv. They believed they'd got away with murder. But at 8:20 p.m. that very same evening, officers arrived at the Marriott, concerned for Simion Turkov. DCI worker initially stated,
"It was a very professional job and would be very difficult to solve."
but with access to the room, the keycard, and the hotel's CCTV, even though at that point they had no idea who the victim was, with camera footage of the assassins dumping their rubbish, they worked backwards to link them to the hotel, forwards to find out where they'd fled to, and soon enough, the assassins were identified. In coordination with Interpol, Europol, and the Israeli police, Melnikov and Antoneli thought that they were safe in their home countries, under the Mafia's protection, for a job well done. But while the investigation was hotting up and evidence was being procured, they were both kept under surveillance. On the 13th of April 2004, barely 2 weeks after the murder, in a coordinated swoop, both men were arrested. Antoneli at his workplace in Antwerp, Melnikov on a street in Tel Aviv, and being held on international arrest warrants until they could be extradited back to Britain. They were later questioned by British police. Charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice, false imprisonment, conspiracy to murder, and murder, 53-year-old Michael Antoneli and 31-year-old Andrei Melnikov were tried at the Old Bailey. Richard Whittam for the prosecution stated to Judge Richard Hone QC,
"This is an extraordinary trial. It is only before you because of the vigilance of a member of public who witnessed the disposal of the evidence, which allowed police to detect Mr. Turkov far earlier than they would have done."
And even though Melnikov and Antoneli denied murder, both being found guilty, on the 25th of July 2005, they were both sentenced to life terms for a minimum of 20 years and to be deported upon their release. As far as we know, the Russian Mafia never successfully launched a hit on Simion Turkov's life, and it is said that the £200,000 debt he owed belonged to Michael Antoneli, although this can't be verified. As of today, Andrei Melnikov remains in a British prison, although he is currently eligible for parole. But having served 17 years of his 20-year sentence, on the 9th of February 2001 at HMP Long Lartin, a maximum security prison, Michael Antoneli, who was then 89, contracted COVID-19 and he died 6 days later. Had they been better as hired hitmen, it's likely that Melnikov and Antoneli may have evaded capture. But having made such a colossal cock-up, it's only fitting that they're known as the hitmen.